January 15th, 1946. The musty attic of a bombed-out farmhouse near Anzio, Italy, held secrets that would reshape historical understanding of World War II. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Whitfield of the U.S. Army Historical Division carefully lifted a leather-bound journal from beneath charred roof beams, its pages yellowed but remarkably preserved. What he discovered within those pages would reveal the psychological terror that a single American unit had inflicted upon the German Wehrmacht, a terror so profound that enemy soldiers had given them a name whispered in foxholes and command posts alike: Schwarz Teufel, the Black Devils. The journal belonged to Oberleutnant Hans-Peter Erdmann of the German 1st Parachute Division, a decorated officer who had fought across multiple fronts. His entries, penned in meticulous Gothic script, documented something unprecedented in military psychology: the systematic breakdown of German morale not through superior firepower or numbers, but through psychological warfare so effective that it had become legend. According to military historian John Nadler's research published in the Journal of Military History, German units specifically requested transfers away from sectors where these American-Canadian forces operated, an almost unheard-of phenomenon in the disciplined Wehrmacht command structure. Erdmann's first entry about the Black Devils dated to December 2, 1943, written from the snowbound peaks of Monte la Difensa in the Italian Apennines. His handwriting, typically precise, showed tremors that evening. He described an impossible military operation, enemy soldiers scaling sheer cliff faces in darkness, appearing like phantoms behind German lines where no attack could logically occur. "They come from nowhere," he wrote, his German stark and fearful. "One moment the position is secure. The next, our sentries are dead, throats cut, and these devils have vanished back into the night." The unit that terrorized Erdmann and his fellow German soldiers was the 1st Special Service Force, an elite joint American-Canadian commando unit formed in 1942. Composed of volunteers selected for physical prowess, mountaineering skills, and psychological resilience, they were trained at Fort William Henry Harrison in Montana for operations deemed too dangerous for conventional forces. Their training regimen included rock climbing, ski warfare, demolitions, hand-to-hand combat, and perhaps most importantly, psychological operations designed to maximize enemy fear. What made the journal extraordinary was Erdmann's analytical attempt to understand his enemy. As an educated officer, he had studied engineering at Heidelberg University. Before the war, he tried to rationalize the fear spreading through his ranks. He documented specific incidents with dates, locations, and casualty figures. On December 6, 1943, he recorded how his company lost 17 men in a single night without a shot fired. The Americans had infiltrated their positions, killed sentries silently, and left calling cards, stickers depicting a crossed American and Canadian flag with the unit insignia placed on the foreheads of dead German soldiers. The psychological impact was devastating. The 1st Special Service Force numbered only about 1,500 men, yet German intelligence reports which Erdmann referenced in his journal consistently overestimated their strength by factors of 10 or more. This cognitive distortion, now recognized by military psychologists as a hallmark of effective psychological warfare, transformed the Black Devils into an almost supernatural threat. Erdmann wrote on December 9th, "Command tells us they are merely a brigade. But a brigade does not appear simultaneously in 6 locations. A brigade does not kill without sound. These are not normal soldiers." February 23, 1944. Lieutenant Colonel Whitfield had spent weeks translating Erdmann's journal, cross-referencing entries with Allied intelligence reports and after-action documents. What emerged was a detailed psychological profile of how elite forces could leverage fear as a force multiplier. The journal revealed that the 1st Special Service Force had not merely fought the Germans, they had systematically dismantled German confidence through carefully orchestrated terror. Erdmann's entries from January 1944 described the evolution of German paranoia. After the capture of Monte la Difensa position, German commanders had considered impregnable rumors spread through Wehrmacht units with viral intensity. Soldiers claimed the Black Devils could see in complete darkness, that they moved without sound, that they were specially selected criminals given pardons in exchange for suicide missions. None of this was true, but truth became irrelevant in the face of cumulative psychological pressure. The journal documented specific psychological tactics that the 1st Special Service Force employed with surgical precision. On January 18, 1944, Erdmann wrote about discovering one of his observation posts abandoned. The sentries had fled their position, an offense punishable by death in the German army, leaving behind a note in broken German. "The worst is yet to come." The note was signed with the unit's now infamous insignia. No attack followed. The message itself was the weapon, leaving German defenders in a state of anticipatory terror that eroded combat effectiveness more than any firefight could. According to documents held in the National Archives in Washington, D.C., as referenced by military historian Robert Burhans in his comprehensive study of special operations, the 1st Special Service Force was trained specifically in psychological warfare techniques adapted from British commandos and Canadian scouts. They learned to maximize the psychological impact of every operation. Small raids were conducted not for strategic gain but for psychological effect. Sentries were killed in ways that would be discovered dramatically. Equipment was sabotaged to create confusion. Most effectively, they moved at night with such skill that German soldiers began to believe superhuman abilities were the only explanation. Erdmann's February entries revealed the personal cost of this psychological campaign. He described watching his men deteriorate. Veteran soldiers who had fought in Russia, in France, in North Africa, began experiencing symptoms that would later be classified as combat stress reaction. They slept in shifts, refused to man positions alone, and fired at shadows. On February 9, 1944, Erdmann recorded an incident where an entire squad opened fire on what they believed was an American infiltration. They had shot 2 of their own men who had returned late from patrol. The journal also revealed the institutional German response to the Black Devils. Wehrmacht intelligence devoted disproportionate resources to tracking the 1st Special Service Force. Erdmann noted that his division received special briefings about American commando tactics, recognition training to identify their insignia and equipment, and explicit orders to report any contact immediately to higher command. The German military was treating a 1,500-man unit as though it were an entire division, precisely the psychological victory the Allies sought. Most revealing were Erdmann's attempts to maintain discipline among increasingly frightened men. He wrote on February 14th, "I have ordered double sentries, overlapping watch schedules, tripwires, and flares. Still they come. Last night we lost 4 men. Their bodies arranged to spell Das Dick and Kommt noch. The worst is yet to come. How do you fight an enemy who turns death into theater?" The question haunted German commanders throughout the Italian campaign. March 7, 1944, the beach at Anzio had become a frozen stalemate. Allied forces pinned against the sea by German counterattacks that threatened to drive them back into the Mediterranean. Erdmann's journal entries from this period revealed a German military confident that the Allied beachhead could be contained, possibly even eliminated. Then the Black Devils arrived, and the psychological warfare that had terrorized mountain positions evolved into something even more devastating in the claustrophobic trenches of Anzio. Erdmann was transferred to Anzio on March 2, 1944. His combat experience in mountain warfare considered valuable for the urban and trench combat developing around the beachhead. His first journal entry from the sector, dated March 4th, showed initial confidence. He described strong defensive positions, excellent fields of fire, and numerical superiority in his section. "The Americans are contained," he wrote. "This beach will be their grave." That confidence lasted 3 days. The night of March 7th changed everything. Erdmann's entry from March 8th was written in handwriting noticeably different from his earlier entries, hurried, with cross-outs and ink blots, suggesting it was composed under extreme stress. The 1st Special Service Force had been assigned to the extreme right flank of the Allied line, the sector facing the strongest German positions. Rather than defend, they attacked. Erdmann wrote, "They came through our lines like water through a sieve. By dawn, we had no forward positions left. 73 men dead or missing? No one heard a thing." What made the Anzio operations particularly terrifying for German defenders was the proximity and persistence of attacks. In mountain warfare, the Black Devils could strike and disappear into terrain. At Anzio, they were operating in close quarters, sometimes infiltrating German trenches that were mere meters from Allied lines. Erdmann documented how American commandos would penetrate German positions, kill sentries, plant demolition charges, and withdraw before dawn, sometimes multiple times in a single night. The psychological impact was catastrophic. The journal revealed that German units at Anzio began refusing to man forward positions. On March 11th, Erdmann wrote about executing a corporal who had abandoned his post, an action that clearly troubled him. He was a good soldier, Erdmann noted. Russia did not break him, North Africa did not break him. But 3 nights facing the Schwarzteufel, and he would rather face a firing squad than return to the line. This tells you what we face. According to recently declassified documents from the U.S. Army Military History Institute, as cited in scholarly analyses of special operations in World War II, the 1st Special Service Force conducted over 500 patrols during the Anzio campaign, taking 25% casualties while inflicting disproportionate losses and psychological damage on German forces. They perfected techniques of silent infiltration using specially designed knives, suppressed weapons, and close-quarters combat skills that made every German forward position a death trap after dark. Erdmann's entries also documented the evolution of German countermeasures. Wehrmacht engineers installed additional wire obstacles, laid more mines, positioned more flares, and increased sentry rotations. Nothing worked. On March 18th, Erdmann wrote, "We have tripled sentries. They kill them. We use wire. They cut it silently. We lay mines. They map and avoid them. Last night they left a note in our command bunker, inside our command bunker, that read, 'You are never safe.' The lieutenant colonel who found it has requested medical evacuation for nervous exhaustion." April 3, 1944. Beyond the actual raids and killings, the 1st Special Service Force waged a sophisticated propaganda campaign that Erdmann's journal documented in detail. The Black Devils understood that physical casualties were less important than psychological dominance. Every operation was designed not just to accomplish military objectives, but to maximize enemy fear, and Erdmann's writings revealed how effectively this strategy worked. The calling cards left on dead German soldiers were just one element of a comprehensive psychological campaign. Erdmann's journal described how the Americans distributed leaflets in perfect German that appeared overnight in German positions. These weren't standard propaganda encouraging surrender, they were personalized threats. On April 7th, Erdmann found a leaflet that read, "You are in the 23rd Fortress Battalion, 3rd Company, 2nd Platoon. We know where you sleep. We know when you rotate guards. We know you are afraid. You should be..." The accuracy of the information was terrifying. The journal revealed that German intelligence attempted to counter this propaganda campaign, but found themselves outmaneuvered. Wehrmacht officers distributed their own leaflets claiming the Black Devils were criminals, that they violated the Geneva Convention, that they would be executed when captured. These counter-propaganda efforts backfired. Erdmann wrote on April 13th, "Our own propaganda makes them more frightening. When we tell soldiers that the enemy will not take prisoners, we do not discourage fear, we confirm that facing them means certain death. The men would prefer to face an honorable enemy than demons." According to military records examined by Lieutenant Colonel Whitfield, the 1st Special Service Force included soldiers fluent in German, Italian, and other languages, specifically recruited for psychological operations. These soldiers crafted propaganda that exploited German cultural fears and military psychology. They understood that Wehrmacht soldiers were trained to respect military hierarchy, so they targeted officers in raids, leaving enlisted men alive but traumatized. They knew German soldiers valued order and predictability, so they attacked randomly, creating an environment where nowhere felt safe. Erdmann documented the breakdown of normal military routine under this psychological pressure. Soldiers refused to retrieve supplies from forward areas after dark. Officers struggled to maintain discipline as exhaustion from hypervigilance accumulated. Medical stations reported increasing numbers of soldiers with what doctors termed nervous complaints, what modern medicine would recognize as acute stress reactions. On April 20th, Erdmann wrote, We are losing more men to fear than to bullets. Yesterday, 2 sentries shot each other in panic. The Americans never fired a shot, yet they killed 2 of my best soldiers. The journal also revealed how the Black Devils exploited German radio communications. Erdmann noted that American patrols would capture German field telephones and listen to communications, learning German positions, patrol schedules, and commander names. Then they would use this information in their propaganda, demonstrating omniscient knowledge that further demoralized German defenders. On April 25th, Erdmann discovered a leaflet addressed to him personally, referencing details of a conversation he had on a field telephone 2 days earlier. He wrote, "They hear everything. They know everything. How do you maintain operational security against an enemy who seems to read your thoughts?" The psychological campaign extended to German rear areas. The 1st Special Service Force conducted long-range patrols that penetrated miles behind German lines, attacking supply depots, cutting communication lines, and leaving their insignia at each site. German rear echelon troops, previously safe from combat, began experiencing the same fear as frontline soldiers. Erdmann's journal entries from late April documented how this deep penetration capability expanded German paranoia throughout the entire sector. "They are not bound by our concepts of front lines," he wrote. "Anywhere within German-held territory, they can appear. We have no safe areas anymore." May 9, 1944. Erdmann's journal entries from early May marked a turning point in his psychological state and that of his unit. The relentless pressure of facing the Black Devils had accumulated over months, and the carefully controlled observations of an educated officer began showing cracks. His handwriting became less precise. Entries grew shorter, more fragmented. The analytical distance he had maintained began collapsing under the weight of sustained fear. On May 11, 1944, Erdmann recorded an incident that epitomized the psychological dominance the 1st Special Service Force had achieved. His company occupied a supposedly secure position 2 kilometers behind the front line, preparing for rotation to rest areas. At dawn, soldiers discovered that during the night, American commandos had infiltrated the entire position, moved through sleeping German soldiers, and painted their unit insignia on ammunition boxes, equipment, and even sleeping soldiers' helmets. Not a single shot had been fired. Nobody had seen or heard anything. The message was clear: you are never safe, and we can kill you whenever we choose. The psychological impact of this raid, which caused 0 casualties, exceeded many deadly attacks. Erdmann wrote, "Better they had killed us all. To wake and find they walked among us while we slept, that they chose to let us live. This is a torment worse than death. The men are broken. Some weep. Others sit in silence, staring at nothing. How do you recover from discovering you were dead, but the enemy chose mercy? What do you call that? It is not combat. It is something for which we have no word." The journal documented the institutional crisis this psychological warfare created within German command structures. Officers who reported the psychological state of their troops faced accusations of defeatism. Wehrmacht doctrine had no framework for addressing widespread combat stress reactions, caused not by sustained bombardment or casualties, but by persistent psychological pressure. Erdmann noted that medical officers were overwhelmed with soldiers exhibiting symptoms they couldn't treat with existing methods. "They call it exhaustion," Erdmann wrote on May 16th, "but these men are not tired. They are afraid, and fear is contagious." According to military analyses conducted by historians at the U.S. Army War College, as referenced in comprehensive studies of unconventional warfare effectiveness, the 1st Special Service Force's psychological operations at Anzio represented a watershed moment in modern military tactics. They demonstrated that properly trained elite units could achieve strategic effects, disproportionate to their size, by targeting enemy morale rather than simply inflicting casualties. The 1,500 men of the Black Devils occupied and demoralized German forces, totaling more than 10 times their number. Erdmann's later May entries revealed his attempts to maintain command effectiveness despite crumbling morale. He instituted buddy systems where soldiers were never alone. He requested additional medical support for psychological casualties. He personally led patrols to demonstrate that Germans could still operate at night. Nothing helped. The mere possibility of encountering the Black Devils had become more powerful than their actual presence. On May 22nd, Erdmann wrote, "I have begun to fear them myself. I dream of them. I wake at every sound. If an officer cannot control his fear, how can I demand courage from my men?" The journal also documented German attempts to capture members of the 1st Special Service Force for intelligence purposes. Wehrmacht command offered substantial rewards for prisoners from the unit, hoping to demonstrate they were merely human soldiers, not supernatural beings. These efforts consistently failed. Erdmann recorded that in his sector, despite months of combat, not a single Black Devil had been captured. The few American bodies recovered from failed raids showed soldiers equipped with standard weaponry, normal men who simply used extraordinary tactics and training. But this knowledge didn't reduce German fear, it somehow made it worse. "They are not superhuman," Erdmann wrote on May 27th. "They are simply better soldiers than we are. That is the most frightening thing of all." June 2nd, 1944. Erdmann's final journal entries were written as Allied forces prepared for the breakout from Anzio that would eventually liberate Rome. The months of psychological warfare had achieved their purpose. German defenders were exhausted, demoralized, and combat ineffective, not primarily because of casualties or lack of supplies, but because sustained psychological pressure had broken their will to resist. Erdmann's last entries provided a remarkable primary source documenting the complete psychological victory the Black Devils had achieved. On June 3, 1944, Erdmann wrote what would be one of his last substantial entries. Allied forces launched their breakout offensive and his defensive positions collapsed within hours. He described soldiers surrendering without serious resistance, officers unable to rally their troops, and the complete disintegration of units that, on paper, should have been capable of sustained defense. "They no longer fight," he wrote. "When American forces attack, my men look to see if they wear the red spearhead insignia of the Special Service Force. If they do, resistance ends. If they do not, perhaps we fight." The Schwarzteufel have won a victory beyond any battlefield. The journal documented Erdmann's own capture on June 5, 1944. Ironically, he was taken prisoner not by the 1st Special Service Force, but by regular American infantry from the 3rd Infantry Division. His final entry before capture reflected on the previous 6 months. He wrote extensively about how his education and military training had not prepared him for psychological warfare conducted with such sophistication. He analyzed how the Black Devils had exploited fundamental aspects of human psychology: fear of the unknown, fear of death and darkness, fear of an enemy who seemed to possess supernatural abilities. According to historical records maintained by the National World War II Museum and referenced in multiple scholarly works on special operations, the 1st Special Service Force was disbanded in December 1944, having achieved virtually every objective assigned. The unit suffered over 2,000 casualties, a staggering casualty rate exceeding 100% when accounting for replacements, but had accomplished what military planners considered impossible. They had broken elite German units through psychological dominance, demonstrating that future warfare would require sophisticated understanding of human psychology as much as tactical prowess. Erdmann spent the remainder of the war in a prisoner of war camp in Mississippi. After the war, he returned to Germany, completed his engineering studies, and became a respected academic. He never publicly discussed his war experiences, but he carefully preserved his journal. After his death in 1983, his family discovered the journal among his possessions. It eventually came into the possession of American military historians through intermediaries, and its contents were declassified in 1997. The discovery of Erdmann's journal provided historians with unprecedented insight into German perceptions of Allied special operations. Previous historical accounts had documented the military accomplishments of the 1st Special Service Force, but Erdmann's daily observations revealed the psychological dimension of their operations with remarkable clarity. His analytical approach, even as his own psychological state deteriorated, created a unique primary source that military psychologists and historians continue to study. Lieutenant Colonel Whitfield spent 18 months analyzing the journal, cross-referencing it with Allied after-action reports, German military records, and interviews with surviving members of the 1st Special Service Force. The correlation was remarkable. Operations that Allied records described in purely military terms: enemy positions captured, casualties inflicted, objectives secured, were revealed through Erdman's perspective as carefully orchestrated psychological attacks designed to maximize fear and minimize actual combat effectiveness in German units. September 20th, 1947. Lieutenant Colonel Whitfield presented his analysis of Erdman's journal to the U.S. Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. His lecture, titled Psychological Warfare as Force Multiplier, Lessons from the 1st Special Service Force, introduced military planners to concepts that would reshape special operations doctrine for decades. The German officer's detailed observations had become an inadvertent textbook on effective psychological warfare, written from the perspective of those it was designed to defeat. Whitfield's analysis identified key principles that made the Black Devils psychologically effective. First, they maintained absolute operational security while simultaneously publicizing their presence through psychological props. German soldiers knew the unit existed and feared its reputation, but could never predict when or where they would strike. Second, they maximized the psychological impact of every operation through theatrical elements: calling cards, propaganda, demonstrations of infiltration capability that transformed tactical actions into psychological weapons. Third, they sustained operations over extended periods, creating cumulative psychological pressure that conventional military doctrine had not anticipated. The journal revealed that German military leadership eventually recognized the psychological dimensions of what they faced but lacked effective countermeasures. Wehrmacht doctrine emphasized discipline, courage, and tactical proficiency, but had no framework for addressing the systematic psychological breakdown Erdman documented. Officers who reported psychological casualties were seen as weak or defeatist. Medical personnel trained to treat physical wounds could not address psychological trauma that didn't fit existing diagnostic categories. By the time German command recognized the scope of the problem, the psychological advantage was irreversible. Erdman's observations also provided insight into why certain psychological warfare techniques proved effective while others failed. Propaganda that simply encouraged surrender or portrayed Germans negatively was largely ineffective against Wehrmacht soldiers trained in ideological commitment and military discipline. But propaganda that demonstrated knowledge of specific German units, named individual soldiers, or revealed information that should have been secret proved devastating because it confirmed German fears about enemy omniscience. The Black Devils didn't just threaten, they demonstrated capabilities that made their threats credible. Modern military psychologists have analyzed Erdman's journal as a primary source on combat stress reactions and the psychological effects of sustained fear. His descriptions of German soldiers' symptoms: hypervigilance, sleep disturbance, exaggerated startle responses, avoidance behaviors, and ultimately psychological collapse align precisely with contemporary understanding of acute stress reactions and post-traumatic stress. His journal provided historical documentation that fear alone, without significant physical casualties, could render military units combat ineffective. The legacy of the 1st Special Service Force extended far beyond World War II. The tactics Erdman documented in his journal became foundational to modern special operations forces worldwide. The U.S. Army Special Forces, formed in 1952, incorporated lessons learned from the Black Devils. The British Special Air Service, Canadian Special Operations Forces Command, and elite units of numerous allied nations studied their operations as templates for effective small unit tactics combined with psychological warfare. The red spearhead insignia that terrorized Erdman became one of the most celebrated military symbols in American and Canadian military history. Erdman's journal also contributed to broader understanding of psychological warfare's ethical dimensions. Military historians and ethicists have debated whether the psychological tactics he described constituted legitimate warfare or crossed ethical boundaries. The Black Devils operated within the laws of war. They wore uniforms, carried weapons openly, and did not torture prisoners, but their psychological tactics deliberately traumatized enemy soldiers in ways that extended beyond immediate military necessity. These debates continue in discussions of modern special operations and psychological warfare techniques. The German officer's final reflections, written as he prepared to surrender, acknowledged a grudging respect for the enemy that had defeated him. "They were the best soldiers I ever faced," Erdmann wrote. Not because they killed efficiently, though they did, not because they were brave, though they were, but because they understood that war is fought in the mind before it is fought on the battlefield. They defeated us psychologically before our physical defeat became inevitable. That is the mark of exceptional warriors. Lieutenant Colonel Whitfield concluded his War College presentation with Erdmann's final observation, written on the day of his capture: "Future wars will not be won by those with the most soldiers or the biggest guns. They will be won by those who best understand the human mind and can turn an enemy's fear against him." The Americans called them the Black Devils. We called them Schwarzteufel. History will call them the soldiers who changed warfare forever. And they will be right. Today, Erdmann's journal resides in the U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, carefully preserved as one of the most significant primary sources on psychological warfare and special operations. In World War II, it stands as testament to the power of elite forces properly trained and employed, and to the German soldiers who faced an enemy unlike any they had encountered before. The fear Erdmann documented was real, profound, and deliberate, a weapon as effective as any gun or bomb, wielded by soldiers who understood that the greatest victories are those won in the human heart before a shot is ever fired.